Congratulations! You've tested your fitness. You've survived the AP Bio exam. Woo! Good job, everybody. Now the really good news. People always ask, what are we going to do after the AP exam? But we're going to save the world. And don't forget, you still get to take my assessment, and I don't have to dumb it down for America, right? So, what do I mean by that? Well, the learning continues, people. That's the good news. What I did want to talk to you about today, of course, is one of the most impressive predators on Earth. By far, one of the most powerful animals in terms of the ocean. It's the second largest toothed predator that's there. It's called the orca, right? Some people know them as killer whales because that's what they're good at doing. Neat thing about orcas, they're not only super powerful, they're the largest dolphin there is, but they also are highly intelligent. They live in family groups. They can live for a lifetime of 90 years, it's been found. They have communication systems that could rival humans if we could actually figure out and understand theirs. It makes sense. Their brain is a lot bigger than ours. And a really cool thing about them, in the southern seas, they eat penguins. And anything that eats penguins is cool to me. Like leopard seals too, right? Now, key thing about this, of course, is the neat thing is they're mammals. And being mammals, they also take care of their young. And orca mothers are highly devoted. You can see this is a new orca that was born right here in Puget Sound. This is the southern resident whale pod that we have. And if we look at this, he's kind of a weird color because he spent a long time in the womb, longer than we spent in the womb. And that mother will, of course, dedicate herself to feeding that baby, keeping him protected. And he will hang out with that pod for likely the rest of his life, he or she. Of course, working together to find food. Now, not only are they really cute little buggers, but they grow slow just like humans do. So they have to learn. That's why they have these family groups that help them to do that. Now, sadly, of course, in Puget Sound, they just recently had an orca born, and they were really excited because they were like, this would be the chance. Because lately, every time an orca is born, a couple months later, it dies. And not only that, they're also finding adult orcas dead in Puget Sound, which is pretty shocking because their numbers are already depleted by us, taking them to SeaWorld during the 1970s and 60s. And if we look at this, those adults are long-lived creatures, and they're dying out pretty fast. And on top of that, they're having trouble making babies, so they're worried about the population. And then they found this orca just the other day floating around. Of course, it looks a little weird because it's an embryonic orca that was aborted. You can see that it has those fingers that get, covered up by its fin later on. And it's got a belly button just like you because it's a mammal too. In fact, it looks very much like you did at one phase in your life. Not so cute though, huh? So that's what I want to know. I want to know, and you're going to draw and explain for me, why baby orcas are dying in Puget Sound, because they're dying like crazy. So are the adults. So pause me. Take a second, try to figure it out, see what you can think about in terms of all that bio stuff we learned in AP Bio that could help you to explain why baby orcas are dying off. It's pretty sad. Cool, let's take this on together. One of the tools that we talked about a bit in our eco issues area was this handy thing that's very good at explaining this. It's called an energy pyramid, right? And the cool thing about the energy pyramid is we know in the ocean, especially in Puget Sound, at the top of the energy pyramid is the orca. So I'm going to draw a really ugly orca real quick. Ooh, look at that beauty. And if we look at that orca, it's hard when you're drawing on plasma. That's bad. That orca, of course, if I want an orca to survive in Puget Sound, most of the orcas that live in Puget Sound, the residents anyways, what they feed on is below them at the next trophic level down. And that, of course, is this famous thing that Northwest has. It's called salmon. Salmon, of course, are a big, fatty fish. They're loaded with energy and nutrients and oils that are not only good for your body, but help build up your energy reserves. To survive, though, of course, that orca in a given amount of time would need to eat at least 10 salmon because, he's only going to get 10% of each meal because 90% of what you eat gets lost as heat. We've already talked about all that stuff, right? It's the cost of being a trophic level up. But those salmon got to eat too, and that's why they're supported by a trophic level as well. And what do they eat? Well, that's the reason why a lot of people in our area have Norwegian names, from Scandinavia. It's because their ancestors came here to fish these things called herring. Herring are these silver fish. They're smaller in size, but they're plentiful in number. And if you've ever had a Swedish fish, yeah, that's a red herring, right? Which is funny because that means something else. Now, to support those one orca, you need 10 salmon, but the salmon got to eat too, and they eat, of course, the herring. They only get 10%. So to have 10 salmon in a given amount of time, you need 100 herring because you're going to lose 90% of it, right? And the herring, well, they're little fish, but they have big old mouths because they're filter feeders. And what they're filtering out is this lovely stuff called zooplankton. And that, of course, is the plankton that's animal-like. This is little shrimp-like creatures, copepods, that live in the ocean. And, of course, they're doing their thing in that ocean. To have 100 herring to support one orca, you would actually have to have a good 1,000 zooplankton. And they're tiny little creatures, so it takes a lot of them to, fill up the herring. And then, of course, being an energy pyramid, it's always going to be supported by the producers, and that's the phytoplankton. So the phytoplankton, of course, would be things like, algae and cyanobacteria, the things that are doing photosynthesis, and these microorganisms, of course, diatoms, radiolarians. Those guys are going to support those shrimp salads. So to have 1,000 zooplankton, you'd need 10,000 phytoplankton. And just like with the great white or shark ETD we did, that means that you need miles and miles of ocean just to support one orca. That's why there aren't 10 million orcas swimming around. It's because you have to have an ecosystem to support it because you lose that energy. But that's an old story, right? What I wanted to know was why baby orcas were dying, right? Well, specifically, I want to know about in Puget Sound. Now, the neat thing is, Puget Sound is a weird thing on the Earth. It is a body of salt water that's attached to the ocean by the Strait of Juan de Fuca. But the cool thing is, it's this cool bay that's protected all the way around, which creates a fairly stable environment that is great for lots and lots of sea life, especially orcas. And that's why for generations and generations, we're talking thousands of years since the Ice Age, this has been a fairly stable environment that's been great for salmon, which has been great for orca, right? And then what happened? Well, with all that salmon and timber, humans moved in, and they started this place called Seattle around the gold rush, right? So they could get to the Yukon. And the trade was pretty good in Seattle area. And so more people came, more jobs. And eventually, as the gold dies out and the West Coast develops, people figure out this is a great place to create a fishery. And, of course, they start going after things like herring. And one of the things they did, of course, was you don't hear about herring much in the Pacific Northwest because we pretty much fished them out. That's why all those Norwegians were so efficient at it that they fished them out. And we like salmon, so we tend to kill off a lot of salmon. That would greatly reduce the amount of food for orcas. Now, that definitely has cut down their numbers because many orcas are starving to death because there's not enough salmon that are there, right? In addition to that, we can see, of course, that we're doing this thing called acidifying the ocean by driving all over the place. That's preventing things like some of the phytoplankton from forming their exoskeletons, which would be a sole protective shell made of calcium carbonate, or the pH drops so much that they start to denature, and that, of course, kills off the fry of the zooplankton as well. So if you knock out all those layers, of course, you're going to have a hard time supporting the orcas, right? Oh, it's like climate change and human decisions affect things. But in our Puget Sound local area, of course, these jobs open up opportunities for people, and people started to move into it even after these salmon started collapsing and all that stuff. And one of the things that moved into this area was in the 1940s was very good at, of course, dropping bombs on places like Japan. And it was this company that needed a way to get to the ocean and had access to good workforce, and they build these big airplanes. Some of your parents probably work for them. It starts with a B. Now, as they were building their bombers, of course, there's one thing we should notice with that. To build a bomber, you have to grind out things like the engine. You have to cut a lot of metal. And if you're going to do a lot of metal working, cutting of metal, it's going to generate a lot of heat, right? And the problem was every time that they did that, they like grind out their drill bits, and that slows down production. You can't win a war if you do that. You can't make money. So what do? Well, humans being crafty like they are, they invented this really cool substance that can soak up massive amounts of heat that the universe had never seen before. It's an artificial synthetic chemical. And this synthetic chemical, because we're really good at them, I'm a chemistry teacher too. This synthetic chemical is called polychlorobiphenyl. Now, it's more famously known as a thing called a PCB, right? polychlorobiphenyls. Now, the cool thing about polychlorobiphenyls is they can soak up tons of heat and they don't break down because they have bonds that are more stable than things that you usually see in nature. So they are basically a coolant. Now, they had to make a lot of bombs to beat Japan. And, if you're going to pump out B-29s, you're going to need a lot of PCBs. And this company that was making these things, won't name names, they had so many left over after that war. And then as their production continued, as they started making jumbo jets and a lot of money in air travel, that they didn't know what to do with the PCBs. And if you sent it to the dump, that would cost money. So instead what they did was they just basically down in the Renton area and up in Everett and in the Seattle area, they're like, okay, well, we'll just take the PCBs and we'll stick them in barrels and we'll put them underneath the tarmac, and then we'll cover it up with tarmac and it'll be sealed off. It'll be great. Don't worry about it, right? They continued production, so some of that, of course, made its way directly onto the tarmac because, you got to clean out the factory from time to time. And then what happened? Well, if you're going to do this, you also need a lot of power. And one other reason why they moved this area is we have a lot of hydroelectric power. With all the dams that we have in this area, you can generate a lot of cheap electricity to run huge factories and have a huge population to actually, build airplanes, make money. Or sell items at Amazon, whatever. This electricity, of course, is really, really dangerous because it's really high voltage. It's created in the generators that are here. To get them to your house and make them safe, you've got to change that electricity, and that means that you have to transform it. So humans invented this thing called transformers. You've seen them. You tend to notice them only when there's a lightning storm and one of them goes out or it blows a transformer. These transformers basically use the process of induction, and they change the high voltage to a low voltage so that it's 120 when it gets to your house and your house doesn't burn down. Thank you, Nikola Tesla. When they're doing that, though, they have to basically slow down the electricity. And when you slow down electricity, that's what a light bulb does. And if you've ever touched a light bulb, it has a lot of resistance. That, of course, produces massive amounts of heat. And, of course, with all that extra heat, they needed something that would soak up the heat so you weren't blowing transformers all the time. And guess what? What worked perfect? PCBs. So they use them in those too. Right? Now, that's great until, of course, a transformer blows or it gets old, and they get old fairly regularly. Then what do you do? Well, companies that run these like PSE, they would have to dispose them and replace them, right? So basically they send them to the dump. And underneath the dump, you find a whole bunch of these PCBs, right? And you're probably thinking, oh yeah, big deal. Well, then something happens that happens all the time in the Northwest. We're the evergreen state because it's ever rainy, right? That's why there's plants. So as rain falls on the dump and rain falls on the tarmac and it falls onto these beautiful paved areas, most of the water that actually flows on Earth flows underground. And as it picks up that and makes its way to the rivers, it would carry those PCBs directly, of course, downhill to this place called Puget Sound, because everything drains to that. It's the lowest point in elevation. Now, unfortunately, that means that it flows under the road to pick it up off Boeing Field and stuff like that. Oops, I said the name. When that happens, of course, if you had done this for the last 100 years-ish, that would result in a lot of PCBs running into Puget Sound. Now, what does that mean? That means if I go down to Puget Sound today and I go and get a cup of water from Puget Sound, and I totally ignore that it's salt water, and I take that cup and I fill it up with a cup, and I go and take a chug of it, how much PCB am I going to get? Very little, right? There's very little PCB. Even though I've got all this, point pollution where they're directly putting it in, and then I've got non-point pollution where it's running off the surfaces, it's not going to be much because every day the tides come in the Puget Sound twice, switch it out, right? Got two high tides, and then they flush this thing. So a lot of it goes out to the ocean, which means it basically gets diluted. So there's not much PCB. There's like 1 part per million, which is not that bad. It's a tiny little dose, no matter what PCBs can do to you, right? Now, that's all good, except for that Puget Sound's not just water, it's a living ecosystem. And one thing that takes in a lot of the water in Puget Sound is this stuff called phytoplankton. They need it to do photosynthesis. That's where they get their low energy electrons from the water. So if you went down and you tested out this phytoplankton, they've been doing a crazy thing throughout their life. They've been doing this thing called bioaccumulation. It's basically the idea that living things, right, collect stuff. They collect stuff over their life. It's kind of like your bedroom floor collects dirty clothes if you don't clean it up. It accumulates. And life collecting stuff, bioaccumulation, means that as these phytoplankton live, they soak up the water around them and they get the good stuff and the bad stuff, right? So for them, they're very, very small and they don't live very long. So each phytoplankton that you find would end up with like 1 part per million. They may like, oh, that could be really bad. I mean, these PCBs don't belong there. After all, they are a carcinogen, right? They cause cancer. Well, that 1 part per million, that might not actually affect the phytoplankton. Maybe it does because they're really small, because it's such a low dose. It doesn't seem like that big a deal. But then again, phytoplankton numbers all over the world are crashing, even in Puget Sound, right? But the real problem happens when those living things get eaten by other living things. And when a zooplankton comes along and it consumes phytoplankton, it, of course, has to eat 10 times as much. And so that creates a very different process. That's called biomagnification. And biomagnification is the idea that as I eat this, if it eats 10 of the phytoplankton, it's going to get the good stuff, but it's also going to get 10 times the amount of the bad stuff. It's going to end up with 10 parts per million of PCBs. This biomagnification means that at each trophic level, I multiply by 10 the amount of good stuff and bad stuff I get, right? Now, what does that mean for zooplankton? Well, PCBs also affect things like embryonic development, and zooplankton numbers are greatly dropped. Their fertility seems to have dropped. And the zooplankton, some of them in parts of the world will be born with 1/2 of their head missing. They only have one eye, like after the BP oil spill. Way to go. Yeah, no effects of those nice chemicals we put in there, Now, key thing of this, of course, is the zooplankton are there, and the ones that are there, they end up with a higher dose of it, but they're small, they live a short time, and then they get eaten by the few herring that still exist, right? Now, as those herring get eaten on the zooplankton, they end up with 10 times much, so they end up with 100 parts per million of the PCBs. Now, what that means, of course, is one thing that PCB does is PCB especially acts as an endocrine disruptor. And unfortunately, it likes to mimic things like estrogen. So a lot of the male herring are growing ovaries in their testes, and that greatly impairs your ability to reproduce. Besides our overfishing, that's why herring stocks have greatly dropped. And that's a big deal if you're salmon, because the living herring that are there, they're going to be loaded with PCBs too, but they're the next level up. So you end up with 1,000 parts per million. And if you haven't noticed, how are salmon doing? For the last 20 to 30, 50 years, they've been really struggling with our overfishing of them and our of course, destroying of all of the different forests that are here that run into their streams and smother them. But they also, of course, are now loaded with PCBs. And that's another reason why their gonads are not functioning correctly and their populations are dropping. The only reason they're still afloat is because we humans spend millions and millions of dollars, we're talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars, to actually take their eggs, spread them upstream, and then raise them in pens, just so we can keep our salmon catch going because we like the salmon, right? Now, what this means for an orca, of course, is the orca is a big animal. It can live for 90 years. It's going to bioaccumulate and magnify so that in that just that given amount of time, it ends up with 10,000 parts per million of PCBs. Now, what does that mean? Well, we've already figured out it's a carcinogen. When they find the dead orcas, they're actually classified as industrial waste. You're not allowed to touch them by law because it could be toxic to your body, which is kind of scary because they're a living creature with a high intelligence. Now, what do these PCBs do to these orcas? Well, one thing is, it's a big animal, and when you get toxins in your body, one of the things you do with them is you store them inside of fatty tissues. So a lot of these big orcas, they can handle it because they've got a lot of that blubber on them. They can store away the toxins inside of it. That's why you don't want to touch or eat that fatty tissue because, of course, then you get the full dose of that in it. But that would, of course, be a huge problem. The other part of this is a lot of those orcas, of course, are so loaded with it and they're taking it in through their food source that you have to recognize the PCBs are carcinogen. And a lot of the orcas they're finding dead, starved to death because their stomach is full of tumors. So there's no room for food and they can't absorb stuff through their digestive tract because their kidneys are just lined with tumors as well. The other part of that, of course, is it's an endocrine disruptor. And being an endocrine disruptor, one of the things that it does is it damages gametes. It basically goes after your gonads and causes infertility. And that's why scientists have been noticed that the orca numbers are dropping, because a lot of these older orcas that are able to survive the toxins, they still can't reproduce because, one, they're old, and two, they're having the wrong loads of estrogen inside their bodies, so they're not developing embryos correctly, right? Which brings us back to what this was about. This wasn't about big orcas dying. This was about baby orcas. And where would I find baby orcas on this energy pyramid? Well, orcas are a mammal. And that means, of course, to be a mammal, you start off your life feeding on your mom's mammary glands. So that means that a baby orca is actually at the very top, the pinnacle of this food chain. And it's feeding off of its mother directly through milk. So that means, of course, if I'm going to do this, I'm actually going to need all of that ecosystem just to support it, and I'm getting a concentrated dose so that the baby orca actually ends up with about 100,000 parts per million. But that's why when they keep getting born, they die within a couple of weeks, because one, this is stored in fatty tissue. Pregnant women gain weight because, of course, that's how you produce milk. Milk comes directly from that fat. So you get the concentrated dose of it. A lot of the babies, when they come out, they can't actually feed because they already have the cancers in their stomach, or they develop them quickly from all the carcinogens. And this endocrine disruptor not only affects your gametes, it also affects fetal development. So a lot of these babies that are born, they actually die because their lungs don't work correctly. They have malformed lungs. That's because we've already learned about how all the different processes of developing an embryo from a turn a meatball into a monkey story. All of that, of course, takes a lot of steps that have to go just right. Now, one of the things that happens with this is their lungs tend to be filled with fluid, because one of the problems is that the endocrine system is tied in with another most complicated system in your body that would protect them from pathogens. That's called immune system, right? That immune system is greatly weakened. Being extremely weakened like that, because it's messed up by this endocrine disruptor, PCBs getting in the way of receptors, the baby orcas actually die because their police force does not function correctly. In fact, most of them don't actually die directly from the PCBs. They die from pneumonia. Now, pneumonia, of course, should only affect things that are really, really old or really, really young and weak, and they should be strong, but they're basically diluting their police force and killing their police force. And of course, the thing that's the saddest of all of that, a lot of them, when they looked them and they did the autopsy on their lungs, and they found all this fluid in there, they also found the bacteria that had caused the pneumonia, and it was fecal coliform bacteria, and it was human fecal coliform bacteria. But that's because this whole area is surrounded by humans, especially places like Victoria dumping raw sewage into it. And, your duty has to go somewhere. It goes downhill, and the bacteria that are used to treat our sewage travel with it into Puget Sound. I mean, every single year, even in Lake Washington and Lake Wilderness, they shut it down from time to time, Lake Washington every last couple summers, because of human fecal coliform, because our poop goes somewhere. And it's kind of scary to think that these baby orcas are dying because human poop bacteria got into their lungs through their blowhole, and they can't fight against it because they have weakened immune systems from the PCB, so we can fly in airplanes. Okay? And then on top of that, of course, it also is connected to the fact of that one that never actually got born. It was born early. It was a miscarriage. When the mom's body realizes that the baby's fetus is not developing correctly and dying inside of her, it aborts it and saves the energy from doing that. But the only problem is, if you keep aborting the baby, you can't make the big orca, and then the orca will go extinct. It's likely within the next 100 years, just from PCBs alone, and from our overfishing of salmon, herring, and global climate change, that orcas will go extinct locally, if not globally. Now, I tell you this because, of course, we should notice something. The orcas are the apex predator of Puget Sound, right? Well, not anymore. They've been replaced. And who replaced them? Humans. So if we put humans, we should put the humans at the top of this thing. And I'll give her a dress. Because, of course, it's not the adult humans that are at the top of this food chain. It's our babies. Because we're mammals too, and we live for a long time. So we bioaccumulate and biomagnify so that at each level we end up with the highest levels of toxins. And the higher on the food chain that you feed, such as salmon or humans' favorite, tuna, very high on the food chain, they are loaded with the greatest amount of toxins compared to the rest of the ecosystem. I don't eat tuna. Very little salmon. It's got to be from Alaskan waters where there's less PCBs if I do. This might explain why, for humans are also seeing problems with things like fertility. We have a lot of fertility problems with humans these days. So many young couples that are like, well, I can't have a baby. Well, it's probably because we pumped a lot of toxins into the world. Also, my own son and many more kids today have asthma. Maybe it has to do with something that we're putting in the environment, because we've learned through self-signaling that it's the environment that decides what your cells do. And a lot of folks are dying or getting sick from their immune system not being able to protect them. They have weakened immune systems, and there's a lot of learning disabilities that they didn't used to see or at least register as much. Maybe it has something to do with changes in brain development. Maybe that's why there's a rise in autism besides, people spotting it more often and being aware of it. But it's definitely much higher than it used to be according to research. Now, I bring this up because, of course, people ask me, what are we going to do at the end of the year? We're going to hope that you become more aware of what we're doing to the planet, and importantly, figure out and share with other people the other ways that we can do this. Now, I've talked about PCBs, but I could have talked about any other chemical or process that's involved in this, right? Because our ultimate goal is to save the world. That's what we're going to do here at the end of this thing. And you can only do that through awareness. You can't do that through ignorance, and you can only do that if you change your choices. But that only happens if you know what your choices and the consequences of them are, right? I, for instance, don't eat tuna, and I eat very little large fish because I'm not worried about just PCBs. I'm worried about things like mercury and lead that come from the electronics that I'm writing on right now, that you're using for, your remote learning and your daily use. Your cell phone has a massive amount of mercury and lead that's used to weld it together. I'm also concerned about, that fish or that food item. I mean, I could just eat some crops on land because they got the water running in too. That could have things like cobalt, and well, that's from my electronics, like those earbuds that everybody just loves, AirBuds, right? Those, of course, are examples of heavy metals, as well as things like I hit the brakes of my car and chromium comes off the actual brake pads, goes into our water systems, and then makes its way into our diet because everything's connected on Earth. Or I could look at those beautiful things called synthetic chemicals, right? Not only have we invented PCBs that last pretty much for shelf life of forever, we don't know when they'll break down because we made them so strong, but we even put into our water bottles these things called bisphenol A's, BPAs, and they've been proven to be an estrogen disruptor. They are an estrogen mimic. They mess up the endocrine system, and that causes a lot of infertility. It's making fish and freshwater ecosystems grow ovaries in their testes, and their numbers are dropping, right? And that's in water bottles. Only just recently did people start to become aware of that. Or maybe let's say you go down to Starbucks and you're like, hey, I want a smoothie. I'm going to get an iced latte and put in one of those nice reusable plastic cups so it feels so good. Well, that plastic has not only BPA in it, it also has things called phthalates, which are hard to say, and most people have no idea what they do. Hey, guess what? Endocrine disruptor. Those could end up in things called microplastics because they get washed downstream as they run off the dump in the rain. And they, of course, go into the ecosystem and are fed up the chain with their phthalates. No wonder there's less tuna these days. Or these wonderful things called dioxins. Also a good coolant, but also a great way to assassinate someone. They're showing up in whales all over the world because they're at the top of the food chain alongside us, right? Or let's say you liked your jewelry. Go buy some gold, right? Well, to get the gold, you have to go to places like South America or places like Montana. And to purify the gold, you have to mix it with this stuff called mercury, because when you do that, it releases this stuff called arsenic that's tied in with the gold as part of the radioactive decay from lead. The mercury helps those things to be isolated, but then you wash it away down into the ecosystem. That's why I don't wear jewelry except for my wedding ring. Or let's say you're really healthy and you just eat apples, right? Well, a lot of the apple orchards out in Wenatchee and stuff, you can't actually build a well on anymore because they treated the apples with arsenic to keep things like apple maggots from eating it. Or maybe you like coffee and you want some of that there caffeine, right? Well, we spray caffeine all over the crops because it kills insects, but there's so much caffeine used in this thing called a neonicotinoid. It's a derivative of nicotine. It's like it to kill insects, but we've been so efficient at it that there's no insects for the birds to eat, and their numbers have crashed too. Now, this is just a small sample of some of the ecological problems that are on Earth. There is a long list, which I'll share with you in a second, but hopefully you recognize an important thing. All of this, of course, makes its way to orcas and to us because we're all connected by things like water and the flow of air. And that water that flows throughout this ecosystem eventually makes it into larger things like the ocean. And you think you're not connected until you realize you're a living thing. And all those things end up pointing it directly at you. It's like Puget Sound is a giant funnel to funnel it straight to your face. That's why when I think about these signs that say, dump no waste, drains the stream, I wish they'd change them and just say that it dumps and drains to you. Because that's eventually what it does because of biomagnification and accumulation. Now, that's a terrifying thought when you consider the next generation. And I have my own kids. And this little butterball right here, he's born and he's healthy. Well, he's kind of got asthma, right? And he was chunky and fat, but all that fat came from feeding off of his mommy. He was a healthy baby, so to speak. But what was passed from him, from the plastic containers that our food come in, from his mommy to him? And I would really like you and my kids and the next generation that's going to inherit this earth to have a healthier place. So that's why we're going to inform ourselves with this thing called the Eco Issues Project, right? And this year it'll be a bit different. This year you're going to be doing it through the remote way, which is a shame. Our public presentations are my favorite part of this. You'll be creating a PowerPoint or basically a slideshow on Google presentation. And then in addition, you're also going to make a 5-minute Screencastify video summarizing basically the big ideas that you'd want anybody to know if you were stuck with a powerful person like a competent president in an elevator for 5 minutes. What do they need to know, right? And then we'll be sharing those with, of course, all your classmates. And I'm hoping they'll be able to share it via YouTube or some other system with the greater public, because usually we invite everybody from the mayor to parents and family members to these presentations, and they're usually pretty impactful. My family usually comes to them. Here are the topics that are available. You can see that this is the list that I've come up with over the years of all the horrible things that we're doing to the planet or that are happening to the planet that we need to reevaluate and think of solutions for. You can see there's ocean acidification, biodiversity, early flowering of plants, flame retardants, aquaculture. What is that? Fracking, heavy metals. I added chocolate production because that's a fascinating one if you look at West Africa today. Smartphones, the things that we live on today. MCHM, whatever that is. PPH, birth control, antidepressants, dead zones. I mean, the list goes on and on. Your job, of course, is to look at this list and figure out what are the top 3 that you're interested in. I mean, flame retardants. Who wouldn't think that, you shouldn't smoke inside your bed so that your pillow doesn't catch on fire? Let's put flame retardants in it so that somebody doesn't do something silly, right? I wonder what the flame retardants do because they don't break down very much. Ooh, palm oil plantations. And if anybody can convince me that paper versus electronic documents, that e-documents are better, I'll be impressed, because this here computer contains a lot of heavy metals. And I guarantee most people don't have a computer that's 10 years old like mine, right? So here's what I want you to do. You're going to have that 5-minute Screencastify video that you're going to make. That's going to be due on the 9th, and we'll share them the rest of the classes. You're going to have a Google presentation that will go along with it that you'll turn into me. Normally you use that for your slideshow. You can use it however you want after that, but basically turn it in and show me you know how to answer all those questions. That'll be all on the question sheet. You're going to submit to me your top 3 topics by Tuesday, the 26th. And how it works is basically every single AP Bio student will have a different topic. So that means that you must, of course, submit as soon as you can come up with your 3 topics, your top 3. And it's first come, first serve. Once somebody picks one, it's not available for anybody else. Each student must have a different one, right? So you want to submit it to me as soon as possible, like not wait till the 26th, because then a lot of topics are gone. As you're doing that, of course, here's an example of what you do. You give me your full student name on the submission document for your top 3, like Puggy McGee here, period 4, and Puggy's top 3 was aquaculture, which a lot of people don't know what it is, but it could change the world for the good or the bad. Also was interested in coffee production and trade. If you're a coffee drinker, I am not, for good reason, but let's find out why. Is there a good way to do it, right? There could be. And then like birth control. Yeah, we don't want too many people on Earth, but what is the birth control methods doing to it? And there's many different forms of that, right? What I advise to you is pick a topic that you know the least about, to challenge yourself, and also to learn more, because this is about learning and becoming informed, right? Don't pick something you know a lot about, like ocean acidification, because then it's not worth your time, right? Near will inform you once you've sent in your topics whether or not you have one of your top 3. If they're all eaten up, then you'll have to go for another one, right? But you want to get it in by the 26th. I would suggest you get it in before then, right? Like on the day it's assigned would be a good idea to send in and submit that, so you guarantee you get the topic you possibly want. There's the topics again. You should probably pause it, look over the topics that you want, like energy consumption, endangered species, coral reef bleaching, nanotech. Ooh, that's a fun one every year. That's going to revolutionize the world. Diseases and pathogens. You cannot do coronavirus. That's way too easy right now. There's lots of other ones. Don't worry. Chagas disease, right? Key thing about that, you got the 5-minute screencast file, you got the Google presentation, and of course, you got to tell me what you're going to do. So make sure that you send those to me as soon as possible. If you come up with a topic that is not on this list that you think would be interesting, let me know. I'm always happy to add more things to this list. Unfortunately, I would rather not do that. But hey, human overconsumption, engineered obsolescence. That's a fascinating topic, right? Cool. I hope that you'll take advantage of this, make yourself more informed, and make the public more informed, because if the Orcas can tell us anything, they tell us that we poison the environment and we need to change our ways, because now we're at the top and the funnel's pointing at us. All right. Thanks.